Well, I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. This is, of course, the day after November the 27th. Kind of doing another one of my election updates. It seems like it's an ongoing saga. I guess we can say that the Kraken has been released, and we'll see how effective it was. And there was also a hearing in Gettysburg before members of the Pennsylvania State Legislature with the president's attorneys, Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis, and some witnesses on the issue on Wednesday. The president, as advertised, didn't show up in person, but did phone in a message. So, okay, it seems like what we have now are some new lawsuits. The Kraken lawsuits are going, I guess, into federal district court in Michigan and Georgia. And are separate, I guess, from previous lawsuits. So it looks like what we're having here is a little bit of what we all call judge shopping, meaning that, the result you get may very well be in a thing like this, depend on the judge you get. So we're looking at that situation to see kind of what we have. All right. The basic complaints, there's still a lot of focus on the Dominion machines. And there's other information out there also. It seems like that the basic thrust is that the Dominion machines have software in them that has a tainted history, at least allegedly, and has capabilities in it that were originally developed for the Venezuelan Chavez regime to steal elections. I guess there's a little bit of pushback, well, a lot of pushback verbally, but without evidence, as our friends on the left always like to say, that in fact the situation is different by Dominion. But what hasn't been ascertained yet is do the Dominion machines still retain the vote switching and adjusting features that were used in Venezuela? The second question would obviously be, were they activated during this election? And of course, the former casts a lot of doubt. The latter would have to be proven to have absolute fraud there on that technique. But obviously, I think you have to say that in last Friday's press conference, Sidney Powell kind of got a little ahead of herself by making certain comments on it, and a more judicious statement of her own evidence would have been much more helpful. That there is a bipartisan concern about these machines. They were rejected in Texas as being inadequately safe, and many leading Democrats have criticized them prior to the election. So there is a lot of true controversy about these machines and a lot of uncertainty, I think. The kind of uncertainty you don't want in your election system, right? There's another set of evidence I'll attach here of a person whose name, unfortunately, I just slipped my mind again, who was the CEO of Overstock.com at one time, and apparently had some adventures afterwards with our friends in the intelligence services. But at any rate, he has some interesting comments on what might have been going on in Arizona, which I thought was interesting on the whole Sharpie issue. And essentially what he's been saying is that the Sharpie doesn't record the votes as accurately as a ballpoint pen would when filling in the little circles, and that it would create a higher rejection rate. And the one thing that would happen is that people could just hit the green button or something when the machine wouldn't read it, and basically hand the ballot off to the election official there to have it entered manually with them, which would leave the possibility of people changing votes manually afterwards, since it wouldn't be recorded by machine. And that's what he's asserting. So that could explain what was going on there. And there's some emails that suggested that they wanted a lot of Sharpies out on election day itself, which, as you know, that was when more of the Republicans were supposed to be coming out, according to projections. So there is something to that story out in Arizona, I think, that's kind of interesting. It's a little separate from the Sidney Powell Kraken material. But getting back to that, the other parts of it, of these lawsuits, are rather interesting. Is that data has been developed which shows that a significant number of people, in the tens of thousands, at least to 20,000 or something like that, in Georgia and Michigan had left the state or died before the election, and they can use data such as change of address forms that were put out and things like them registering and potentially even voting in other states. And so apparently there's a significant amount of this, which at least in the Georgia case would be significant enough to account for a lot of the voting irregularities. Other things that are in there involve, and it seems to me this is uniform in these Democrat precincts, is that there's been a systematic effort to keep poll observers, particularly Republicans, but perhaps both, away from having adequate visibility to see what's actually happening in the vote counting process. The Powell lawsuit claims that people witnessed instances of such things as the counting of votes that were for Trump and dropping them in the Biden bin, or votes that were for the fringe candidates or no votes and dropping them in the Biden bin during the hand recount, which may invalidate some of the hand recount numbers. And just to give you the idea, the sort of thing that's in there, and I always point out that they do attach also the affidavit of the individual who allegedly witnessed unusual ballot forms that seem to be, somewhat, printed out by machine rather than filled out by a human being on different paper, suggesting that the actual ballot itself was fraudulent. And that's a significant issue here. Now, at the same time, the Lynn Wood original lawsuit which was rejected at the district court level, has now advanced to the circuit court level for the southeastern United States, and also the Trump lawsuit that is dismissed in Pennsylvania with prejudice has moved to the Third Circuit Court for emergency appeal. So there's a lot of court action. There's a state court action in Pennsylvania, which also has temporarily held up the certification of everything but the president, apparently, that was filed by a congressional candidate, and that was basically saying that the actual procedures that were used in the law that was changed before the Pennsylvania election is unconstitutional. Of course, since it's a state court action, we can definitely anticipate that ultimately the state Supreme Court will quash that. So I don't know. At most, that's kind of a holding or distracting action, or another way to set a precedent for additional entry into the federal system. Essentially, I think what's going on here is the attempt to basically create multiple avenues to get through appellate courts and to create situations for appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think that's the target of this effort, because the lower courts are obviously very squeamish about really stepping up to this issue, and the fact is it's hard to get adequate proof. Now, an interesting claim has been made in the Pennsylvania hearing for the legislature with Rudy Giuliani, and he makes the interesting claim that on the official websites, I guess, of the Pennsylvania election authorities, I guess the Secretary of State or whatever, that they indicate that they'd sent out a total of 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 1.4 million back, but they've actually counted 2.5 million votes. And that seems to be mathematically impossible. I don't know whether, and then I think at this point they've now taken their stuff down. So it looks like there's, some problems. They had witnesses there again that needed to testify about Democrat obstruction and interference in proper election procedures. There's a case of 47 missing USB cards that are relevant to the Dominion system that's been testified to in the Pennsylvania environment. So we again get the idea that there's significant irregularities. I think these are the cards that were like the 3,000 votes that were found in Georgia because the card wasn't inserted. That could be 47 of these cards could be a significant amount of votes. It's hard to know exactly what's going on, but overall, this is really, this all stinks. Let's be blunt. If the Democrats want to have widespread acceptance that they won with a fair election, I think they're losing that. Whether they actually take the office by process, let's call it, is a different issue. Because as I read it right now, given the states that are not in controversy, I mean, states like California and Texas and Missouri and New York and so forth, those kind of states where there's no controversy, either Biden or Trump has won those electors. Okay, the states are in conflict. I think enough of them have certified at this point for Biden that will give him the electoral victory at this point. So the only thing that will stop it will be if some court or I guess a legislature, but probably a court actually stops it by a judicial ruling and requires some kind of recount or re-audit or re-evaluation of some sort. And so that's what we're waiting for. And I think the paths only lead to the Supreme Court. The other thing that would be very helpful is, since there's multiple suits going on, as I point out, Lynn Wood has a suit which has got to the circuit court level, the appellate court, okay? But Sidney Powell's lawsuit is currently just in district court, a separate suit. I presumably might get a separate judge because it's a separate plaintiff. You might end up at some point just randomly get some judge that will take this thing seriously and make some rulings that may, slow up the process. And I think ultimately a lot of this may need to get consolidated at the Supreme Court level into a single issue, because a lot of the issues are basically the same in some ways, and that is obstructing poll observers so that malfeasance is possible. I mean, there's no way to deny that reasonably has happened, except for people who are lying. They did do that. Now, what they did when they weren't being observed, we don't know for sure. But like another example of things is that the water leak that was supposed to have ended counting in Georgia, I think it was in the Fulton County count, it turned out that, in fact, it was fallacious. There was no such water leak at that time. There apparently had been a toilet that backed up earlier, but it had nothing to do with the voting area. So it's not sufficient to have shut down. So it seems like this was a ruse. And again, you continually have these claims of mishandling ballots and stuff. The other thing is you have apparently fraudulent voters. There's been an effort that's been put together where people have been tracking down some of the addresses of people that were registered that were suspicious. And I think I mentioned that in my last video, that they'd register, say, at a UPS center with a mailbox. And instead of calling it mailbox number such and such, they would call it apartment such and such. But when you check it, the address is not a residential address. It's a business address. And it's an address, apparently, of a mailbox there, but not properly stated as such. And apparently there's thousands of these cases out there, too. So, and of course, the problem I think we have now, I keep hearing the idea that they haven't checked the signatures. Now, that would at this point, as I understand, the ballots have been separated from the signature envelopes. And so you can't really directly say, okay, this is a fraudulent signature, so throw out this ballot. That data has been lost, in my opinion. At least that's my understanding. If I'm wrong, please make a comment and correct me. I'm trying to get the facts here. It's a very dynamic situation, a lot of changing issues, and I'm doing the best one can following this thing. But I think that's the fact. And so what we could end up with is the idea of proportionality. What would the remedy be? And an idea that's come up, well, one idea would be to tag Biden with all the remedy, but it's possible a more balanced approach that might be acceptable to a court would be to simply use the proportion of the votes in a given district for Trump and Biden. And if you, in other words, if you could show that there were, 10,000 fraudulent votes in a different district, and 80% of the votes in that district went for Biden and 20% went for Trump, and there were 10,000 fraudulent, we could simply reduce the Trump count by 2,000 and the Biden count by 8,000, which would still increase Trump's net by 6,000. So that might be some relief that might just be enough to help us out. And it would seem to be a fair thing in using a statistical sampling of, how many votes you could turn out that prove that were fraudulent because of the fake addresses that they'd moved out of state, had voted in other states as well. I mean, there really seems to be a lot of activity on the, presumably mostly on the Democrat side, to cheat here. It seems like it's at some levels it seems systematic in terms of obstructing poll watching and other activities, but on other levels, even at the grassroots level, it seems to be kind of endemic. It seems to be kind of a little of both. There's systematic fraud and there's random or unsystematic fraud that still being a little bit bigger than you normally expect here. So that's kind of my rundown. The point is that there's a lot of legal activity going on in various courts, and we've yet to really hit the Supreme Court with a big case yet. And I think the Pennsylvania case seems to be, or maybe the Georgia case, but probably the Pennsylvania case seems to be the most likely to hit the Supreme Court first, since it's already an emergency appeal in the Third Circuit. I don't know if we'll hear from them today or not. I suppose if they're, there's several things they can do, of course, as well, and we'll wait to see how that goes. The other thing that seems to be pervasive here is the following pattern. I'll try to attach a link to a web page that kind of shows these graphs. But what you see repeatedly is the process at which the vote is going forward. Trump is leading Biden. The votes are moving systematically until fairly deep into the count, when you kind of get the idea that you're kind of there. All of a sudden, there's a big spike in favor of Biden that puts Biden ahead. And then from that point on, it continues to proceed relatively normally, except that Trump can never catch up now because of the spike to Biden. And this seems to be happening in repeated states and seems to be statistically anomalous. There's also other data out there that suggests that there's there's certain districts where the voting was incredibly heavy in favor of Biden, more than one would normally expect from those districts in previous elections. And I think at the global level, what's really perplexing the Republican side is just the pure magnitude of the votes for Biden, that he has exceeded as a percent of the registered vote count now. I mean, because obviously the population increases over time, obviously, but that he's actually outperformed, almost all these previous Democrats. He outperformed Obama, he outperformed Clinton, and yet he had the weakest, saddest campaign you possibly could imagine, So you have to sit there going, what's going on here? I mean, it does seem perplexing and leads to some of the more outrageous claims that have been made about massive vote switching and stuff. And the fact of the matter is, other than the hand recount in Georgia, a lot of these cases, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, there really hasn't been a real thorough recount of the ballots themselves. And even when there is one, the recount does not, it's just a count. Nobody's actually examining the ballots for potential signs of fraud. And I think that's something that should be done, and it's possible that the fraud is still being maintained a little bit. Like, people putting the wrong ballots in the Georgia recount in the wrong bins and stuff like that. Are they trying to hide something there? We kind of wonder about that. And of course, so anyway, I guess that kind of is my rundown on the status right now. We just basically await some court rulings at this point. The time is running out to some extent. I mean, the electors are supposed to be picked on December the 8th, which gives us sort of a limited time to, get things done. And the electors are supposed to vote on the 14th. Now, it is possible, in my opinion, if there is a court ruling, that could get held up or changed even after those dates. After those dates are not set by Constitution, they're basically set by law. And of course, laws can be fudged by court rulings, as we've seen already. So maybe we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. I think that kind of wraps up what I've got for the day. I think it gives you a summary, and some of the attachment I'll put in there will be helpful when you see these graphs on the tallies. So if you like this, give me a like. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe. As I say, hit the bell, and you can forward these, of course, to anybody that might be interested. So I'll sign out for now. We'll keep monitoring the situation.